The HOA in my neighborhood had always been a little overbearing. I had been living in the area for years, and while I wasn't exactly thrilled with all of the rules, I did my best to follow them. The HOA president, however, was a different story. Her name was Karen, and she was the type of person who thrived on power. She wasn't just the president of the HOA. She controlled every aspect of the community, from the landscaping to the rules about trash cans. If you stepped out of line, Karen was right there to remind you. At first, I didn't mind much. Sure, Karen was a little uptight, but I could deal with it. Then something changed. It started with the trivial things. An email about overgrown grass that I hadn't even noticed. Then the warnings came. Karen told me my front door paint was too bold, and that I needed to repaint it to meet HOA standards. Little things that she used to flex her muscle. I didn't want to deal with it. I wasn't some rebellious type, but at the same time, it seemed like Karen was targeting me for no reason. The more I tried to comply, the more unreasonable her demands became. It wasn't long before the situation escalated beyond the point of absurdity. One day, Karen knocked on my door. I opened it to find her standing there, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. "Your mailbox is out of compliance," she said without so much as a greeting. "What?" I asked, baffled. "It's just a mailbox. How is it out of compliance?" "It's not the right size. The color is wrong. And quite frankly, it doesn't look up to standard. You'll need to change it within a week, or you'll face a fine." I was stunned. A fine over a mailbox? This was getting ridiculous. I tried to remain calm. "Karen, this is beyond ridiculous. You can't possibly enforce this kind of thing. I haven't broken any laws." She didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at me, clearly enjoying this small bit of power she wielded. It was at that moment I realized this wasn't about the mailbox. This was about control, and I wasn't going to let her bully me. That night, I decided to take a stand. I would attend the next HOA meeting and voice my concerns. I knew Karen would be there, and I wasn't about to let her continue making these absurd demands without some pushback. The next meeting was like any other until Karen walked in. She had a habit of making grand entrances, but today, there was something different about her. She seemed more aggressive, more confrontational, and as the meeting went on, it became clear that her control over the group was slipping. People were starting to speak up, asking questions, challenging her. The room was tense as Karen's grip on the HOA began to falter. Finally, it was my turn to speak. "Karen," I began, standing up in front of the group, "this has gone too far. You've been harassing me over a mailbox, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. You've used your position to bully residents into submission. We won't stand for it anymore." Karen's face reddened with anger. "You think you can take me down with your complaints? You think I'll let you make a mockery of me? I've had enough of your attitude." Before anyone could react, she stormed out of the room. The tension in the air was thick, and I couldn't help but feel like I'd made a serious enemy. But I wasn't afraid. I had done what I needed to do, or so I thought. The next day, I received a visit at my door. I opened it to find Karen standing there, a determined look on her face. But there was something in her eyes that I had never seen before. A cold, calculating rage. "I told you not to challenge me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You're going to regret this." Before I could respond, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small handgun, pointing it directly at me. I froze, staring at the weapon in her hand. "Don't try anything," Karen hissed. "I'll shoot if I have to." My heart raced as the weight of the situation hit me. I had never imagined that things would escalate this far. One minute, we were just neighbors arguing over a mailbox, and now Karen had a gun in her hand, threatening my life. But I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. Not now. Not after everything she had done. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Karen, you're making a huge mistake," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You think you're in control, but you're not. You can't just threaten people to get your way." She laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "I've been in control for years, and you think you can just walk in and ruin everything? You have no idea what you're dealing with." I knew I had to act fast. There was no way I was going to let her get away with this. She had already crossed a line, and now it was time for me to turn the tables. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," I said, my voice firm, "and you've just made your last mistake." In a split second, I moved. My hand shot out, grabbing the gun from her trembling fingers. Karen's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. I had control of the weapon. "I'm taking this from you," I said, looking her dead in the eyes. "And now, you're going to be the one to answer for your actions." I backed away from Karen, the gun in my hands, and I could see the terror in her eyes as she realized the tables had turned. But I wasn't about to use it. I wasn't a violent person. I simply wanted to disarm her and make sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. "Call the police," I said, tossing the gun onto the table. "You've gone too far, Karen. Now it's time to face the consequences." Karen didn't move. She stood there, stunned, as I walked toward the door and made the call. Within minutes, the police arrived. When they saw the gun, Karen's fate was sealed. The evidence was clear. She had threatened me with a firearm. There was no getting around it. As Karen was arrested and taken away, I felt a mixture of relief and anger. The woman who had terrorized our community for so long, who had used her power and influence to control everyone around her, was finally facing the consequences. It had taken everything I had, but I had taken a stand, and I had exposed her for the bully she was. And as I watched her being led away in handcuffs, I knew that I had done the right thing. I had fought back, and I had won. Karen's reign of terror was over. As Karen was led away by the officers, I stood in the doorway, watching the events unfold in a surreal haze. It felt almost too surreal to be true. Just a few hours ago, I had been confronting a woman whose power seemed absolute, and now she was shackled and facing the consequences of her own choices. But even as I felt the rush of victory, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. I knew that the arrest was just the beginning, and the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure what would happen next. Karen had always been one step ahead of everyone, and even now, she had to have a backup plan. I couldn't afford to think this was over. The officers took her away, and I was left standing in the doorway, holding the weight of everything I had just done. I had stopped Karen from using a weapon on me, but I had also just opened a whole new can of worms. The HOA, the neighborhood, everything was connected in a way I hadn't fully realized until now. Karen had her claws in everything, and the damage she had caused wasn't just personal. It had affected everyone who had lived in the community. As I sat down to process what had happened, Diana called. Her voice was steady, but I could sense the concern. "I know this is overwhelming," she said, "but we've only just begun. The authorities are going to want to know everything. You did the right thing, but now we need to make sure everything is in place to ensure Karen doesn't find a way out." "I know," I replied, my voice low. "But what's next? She's going to try something. I just feel it." Diana sighed. "She's already caused enough damage, but she's not going to give up. She's going to fight this, and she has connections. We need to stay ahead of her. If we can keep the pressure on her now, there's a chance we can make sure she faces real consequences." Her words were sobering. Even though Karen was arrested, she still had resources. I couldn't allow myself to think that the worst was behind me. It was just beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings with the police, and the mounting pressure of dealing with Karen's fallout. The community was rattled. People who had once blindly followed her were beginning to wake up to the reality of her actions. But they were also scared. Karen's influence had run so deep that the entire HOA was unsure of what would happen next. I spent a lot of time talking to neighbors, helping them understand what had really been going on. Many were angry, but there was fear there too. They had all been victims of Karen's manipulation. Some of them had paid fines for things that didn't exist, while others had been forced into unfair deals for repairs or upgrades they didn't need. But now they had a chance to rebuild. Slowly, people were starting to come forward, sharing their stories of how Karen had bullied them into submission. It felt like a massive weight had been lifted, but as I worked with the police to help build the case against Karen, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as simple as I had hoped. Karen had made powerful enemies, but she had also made powerful allies. And as the investigation began to uncover more of her shady deals, I realized just how far-reaching her influence truly was. There were whispers that the charges against her might not stick. Powerful people had been benefiting from her scams, and some of them were already scrambling to cover their tracks. The deeper we dug, the more I realized how far Karen's corruption extended. She had ties to local politicians, business owners, and contractors who had been helping her manipulate the HOA for years. The more I learned, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just some rogue HOA president. She was a key figure in a much larger operation. And now, the entire operation was under threat of being exposed. One evening, as I sat down to review new documents from the police, a text message popped up on my phone. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. "You're in over your head. Drop this, or it will cost you." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was Karen's way of telling me she wasn't finished yet. Even though she was behind bars, her influence still lingered. The people she had surrounded herself with weren't going to let this go quietly. I showed the message to Diana, and her face grew serious. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said, her tone calm but firm. "Karen's associates think they can scare you into backing down, but we can't let them. We have to keep moving forward." I nodded, but I couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at me. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the people she had empowered, the people who were now trying to protect their own interests. If I wanted to make sure Karen faced justice, I had to make sure the entire network she had built came crashing down. The next few days were filled with tense meetings, threats, and more intimidation tactics. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's people were closing in on me, trying to silence me before I could expose everything. But I wasn't going to let them. I reached out to the authorities again, this time asking them to increase security. Karen's associates were starting to show up in unexpected places, at my workplace, at my home. It was becoming clear that they would stop at nothing to protect their own interests. And then came the phone call that changed everything. It was from one of Karen's former employees, someone who had worked with her for years. They wanted to talk, wanted to give more information about her illegal activities. They promised to testify against her if it meant taking her down for good. This was the break we had been waiting for. The call was a game changer. I had suspected that Karen's operation ran deeper than what was visible on the surface, but this was the first real lead I had gotten from someone on the inside. I arranged to meet the former employee, a man named Greg, in a secluded spot where he wouldn't be recognized. He had been with Karen for years, working directly in her shady dealings, and now he wanted to make things right. When I met Greg, he was nervous, his hand shaking as he sat down across from me in the dimly lit coffee shop. His eyes darted around constantly, as if he was expecting someone to come after him at any moment. The air between us was thick with tension, but I knew this was my opportunity to gather the final pieces of the puzzle that had eluded me for so long. "I don't know how to even begin," Greg said, his voice low. "I've been working for Karen for too long, doing things I'm not proud of, but I can't do it anymore. I've seen what she's done to people. I've seen how she used her position to manipulate everyone, including me, and I can't be a part of it anymore." I leaned forward, urging him to continue. "Tell me everything. Every deal, every person she worked with. We need to bring this whole operation down." Greg nodded, his face turning pale as the weight of his confession seemed to settle on him. Karen wasn't just making money from the HOA. She was running a whole network. It wasn't just about overpriced repairs and fines. She used her position to manipulate people into selling their properties at below-market prices. Then she'd resell them, pocketing the difference. She was in bed with contractors, real estate agents, even some politicians. It was a whole system built on lies. The more Greg spoke, the more disgusted I became. The scale of Karen's operation was far worse than I had ever imagined. She had been using her control over the HOA to execute real estate fraud on a massive scale, forcing homeowners into situations where they had no choice but to sell. The stories of manipulated contracts, forged signatures, and stolen homes were shocking. Greg continued, detailing how Karen had ensured the HOA board was filled with people who would do her bidding. She had planted her allies everywhere, all while controlling the narrative with fear and intimidation. He spoke about how they would use threats to force people to comply with Karen's demands, how they would silence anyone who dared to speak out against her. "This is bigger than just her," Greg said, shaking his head. "There are people in high places who would protect her. I can't guarantee your safety if you push too hard." I could see the fear in his eyes. He was torn between his guilt and the fear of retribution from Karen's powerful allies. But I knew this was the breakthrough we needed. If we could get the right people to testify, if we could expose her entire network, we could bring Karen down once and for all. But I also knew this was going to get dangerous. "Do you have anything to back this up?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Documents? Contacts? Anything that can prove what you're saying?" Greg hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. "I kept some things, emails, contracts, bank statements. I've been holding on to them in case this day came. You need to get this to the authorities. It's all the proof you need." I took the folder from him, my heart pounding. This was it. We had the smoking gun. But as I left the coffee shop and walked to my car, a dark thought crossed my mind. What if Karen was watching? What if she knew what we were up to? I couldn't afford to let my guard down. That night, I went over the documents Greg had given me. There were contracts with signatures that didn't match the ones on file, emails discussing the undervaluation of properties, and bank statements showing payments that weren't properly accounted for. Everything lined up perfectly with what Greg had said. It was all there, proof of Karen's massive fraud operation. But there was a problem. Karen's network was so vast, and her connections were so entrenched, that I wasn't sure how we would get the authorities to act fast enough. What if they were already in on it? What if someone in the system was protecting her? The deeper I dug, the more complicated things seemed to get. The next morning, Diana and I met to go over the evidence. "We've got everything we need," I said, spreading the documents out on the table. "This is our chance to finally expose Karen for what she is. But I'm worried. I don't know who we can trust." Diana's expression was serious as she looked over the papers. "I understand your concerns, but we can't let fear stop us. This is the moment. If we go public with this, there will be no turning back. But Karen won't go down quietly. She'll try to destroy anyone who stands in her way." I knew she was right. If we exposed Karen, there was no guarantee we would walk away unscathed. She had proven time and time again that she would stop at nothing to protect her empire. But if we did nothing, if we let her continue her reign of manipulation and fraud, we would be just as complicit as the people who had enabled her. "We need to go to the authorities," Diana said firmly, "and we need to make sure they take this seriously. But we also need a plan to protect ourselves. If Karen has allies, we need to be prepared for what comes next." I agreed. We couldn't afford to let our guard down now. Karen had done too much damage, and we had finally reached the point where we could stop her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of an even bigger battle. Diana and I spent the next few days meticulously preparing our plan. We knew that exposing Karen's web of fraud wasn't going to be easy. There were powerful people involved in her schemes, and some of them would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But we had something Karen didn't, the truth. The evidence we had gathered was irrefutable, and we were determined to make sure it saw the light of day. The authorities had already taken a keen interest in the case, but there was still a sense of hesitation. Karen's connections ran deep, and there were whispers that she had friends in high places, people who could make this whole thing go away. We couldn't trust that they would act quickly enough, so we made the decision to go public with the information we had. If the authorities weren't going to act, we would take matters into our own hands. Diana reached out to a few trusted journalists who had covered similar stories of corruption and fraud. We needed to make sure that once the story broke, there was no turning back. The media attention would force the authorities to act, and Karen wouldn't be able to hide behind her connections any longer. It wasn't the safest move, but it was the only option we had. On the morning the story was set to break, I felt a knot form in my stomach. There was no turning back now. If we were going to expose Karen, we had to be prepared for the fallout. But I had already made my peace with the fact that there would be no easy path. I spent the entire day at home, nervously checking the news and waiting for the moment when the story would hit. The phone calls, the texts, and the notifications began flooding in as soon as the article went live. The details of Karen's operation, Her manipulation of the HOA and the real estate scams she had orchestrated were out in the open. People I had never met before were reaching out to me, sharing their stories of how they had been taken advantage of by Karen. But with the good came the bad. Almost immediately, I started receiving threats. Anonymous calls, emails, and messages flooded in, each one more aggressive than the last. "Back off, or you'll regret it," one message warned. "This isn't over," another said. It was clear Karen's associates were trying to intimidate me into silence. The threats were unsettling, but they only fueled my determination. Karen had caused so much harm to so many people, and now she was trying to silence me too. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Diana and I met that evening to discuss the next steps. "We need to be ready for retaliation," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. "Karen won't stop now, but this is bigger than her. This is about the people she's hurt, and we can't let her intimidate us into backing down." We set up a security plan, working with a few trusted friends and local authorities to ensure our safety. We didn't know what Karen was capable of, but we knew we couldn't take any chances. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. The media continued to cover the story, with more and more details of Karen's fraud coming to light. People were outraged, demanding that she be held accountable for her actions. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Her lawyers were already preparing their defense, trying to discredit everything we had presented. They claimed we were misinterpreting the facts, that the documents we had were fake. But each time they made their claims, we had more evidence to back us up. Karen's lies were starting to unravel, and the pieces of her fraudulent empire were slowly falling apart. Her once unshakable hold on the neighborhood was slipping, and with each passing day, I could feel the walls closing in on her. But I knew it wasn't over. Karen was a dangerous woman, and she had more tricks up her sleeve. She wouldn't just disappear quietly. She had already proven that she would do whatever it took to keep her empire intact. And then, as I was preparing for what I knew would be the final showdown, I got a call that made my heart stop. It was from the police. "We found something," the officer on the line said. "Karen has more assets hidden than we initially thought. She's been laundering money through several shell companies. We need your help to track down where the money's going." The gravity of what he was saying hit me all at once. Karen wasn't just a fraudster. She was part of something much bigger. Money laundering, illicit deals, and hidden accounts were all tied into her schemes. This was no longer just a matter of exposing an HOA president. It was about bringing down an entire criminal operation. I rushed over to meet Diana and the police. They had found accounts tied to Karen's companies that led to offshore banks, and there were transactions that indicated she had been funneling money into various international accounts. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about an international network of corruption, and I had unwittingly stepped right into the middle of it. The police officer handed me a file. "This is bigger than we thought, but we need your help to track down the final pieces. If we can get this information to the right people, we can bring everything down." I nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. This was far more than I had bargained for, but I couldn't back out now. I had already come too far. And now, it wasn't just about Karen. It was about taking down the entire system that had allowed people like her to thrive in the first place. The next few days felt like an endless whirlwind. The realization that Karen's schemes had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined hit me hard. The evidence I had gathered, the money trail, the offshore accounts, all of it pointed to a criminal enterprise of staggering scale. And it wasn't just Karen at the center of it. She had built an entire network of people, all of whom were complicit in this web of fraud and corruption. If we were going to expose her, we had to go deeper. We had to bring down the whole operation. Diana and I met again with the police to discuss the next steps. The documents Greg had provided were solid, but they weren't enough to bring the entire operation down. We needed more people to come forward, more evidence that linked Karen to every illicit deal. The deeper we dug, the more we realized that Karen had a far-reaching influence, not just in the neighborhood, but in the local government and even in real estate networks. She had become a player in a much bigger game. We started gathering testimony from people who had been affected by Karen's manipulation, homeowners who had been forced to sell their properties at undermarket prices, contractors who had been coerced into working on overpriced jobs, and even former employees who had been intimidated into silence. Each person's story was a piece of the puzzle. The more people we talked to, the clearer it became that Karen's entire operation was built on intimidation and lies. But Karen wasn't backing down. She had a team of lawyers working overtime to counter every accusation we made. They claimed the evidence was fabricated, that Greg's testimony was unreliable, and that everything we had was circumstantial. But Diana wasn't about to let them get away with it. She kept pushing forward, lining up expert witnesses, financial analysts, and even forensic accountants who could confirm the extent of Karen's financial fraud. We also started looking into Karen's connections. She had allies everywhere, people who were helping her hide the money and keep the entire operation running smoothly. We had to uncover their identities, too. I knew that if we could expose the entire network, Karen wouldn't be able to escape. But the further we dug, the more dangerous it became. We were making powerful enemies. I started receiving more threats. Some were subtle. A quiet message left at my door, an anonymous email warning me to stop asking questions. Others were more direct. I came home one night to find my car tire slashed. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to take this lying down, but it only fueled my determination. She had crossed a line by pulling a gun on me, and now she was going to face the consequences of her actions. But then, just as I thought we were making progress, something unexpected happened. Diana received a call from one of her contacts in the police department. They had uncovered something that changed everything. Apparently, Karen had been making backroom deals with a local politician, one who had been using his position to shield her from scrutiny. This politician had been helping her launder money, using his influence to bury complaints and protect Karen from legal trouble. The web was even bigger than we had imagined, and Karen wasn't just a criminal in her own right. She was part of a larger political network. We realized that in order to take Karen down, we couldn't just focus on her actions. We had to expose the entire system that had allowed her to operate with impunity. It was a risky move. The more powerful the people we targeted, the greater the danger. But we couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had happened. We began working on a strategy to bring the politician into the fold. Diana had connections to an investigative journalist who had covered similar cases of political corruption in the past. With their help, we could start pulling at the threads that connected Karen's criminal activities to the higher-ups. We needed to make sure that when Karen's empire collapsed, it brought everyone down with it. I felt the pressure mounting. The threats were becoming more intense, and the stakes were higher than ever. But there was no going back. Karen had hurt so many people, manipulated so many lives, and now it was time for her to pay for what she had done. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she had taken advantage of. One night, after an exhausting day of meetings and paperwork, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the evidence in front of me. The stack of documents seemed endless, each page revealing another layer of deceit. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, realizing how close we were to bringing everything into the light. But the thought of Karen's powerful allies still loomed over me. Could we really pull this off? Could we take down the entire network without putting ourselves in danger? Diana called me that night. "We've got one more lead," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I've been working with a journalist. We've got confirmation that Karen's associates are planning to move some of her assets overseas. If we can act fast, we can stop them before they manage to hide everything." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "What's the plan?" "We need to intercept the transactions before they happen," Diana said. "We have a narrow window of time. If we can freeze the accounts and seize the assets, we'll have the leverage we need to force Karen's hand." I didn't hesitate. "Let's do it." We spent the next few days coordinating with the authorities, working with the journalist to expose Karen's international connections. We had a team ready to move, but time was running out. Every moment that passed felt like a ticking clock. If we missed this opportunity, Karen would slip away again. As the hours ticked down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was one step ahead of us. She had always managed to stay ahead, to manipulate and control every situation. But this time, we had the upper hand. This time, she was going to face justice. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, urgent meetings, and the kind of frantic activity that comes with a last-minute push to prevent someone from slipping away. Diana had assembled a small team of trusted individuals who could move quickly and quietly. But Karen wasn't going to make this easy. We had received intelligence that she was aware of the investigation into her finances, and we could already hear the wheels of her countermeasures turning. If we were going to intercept the transaction, we had to move quickly. The assets were being moved through several different accounts, each one a link in the chain that would eventually lead to an offshore account. If we could freeze these transactions before they went through, we would have enough leverage to bring Karen to the negotiating table. But time was against us. We couldn't afford any mistakes. Every second mattered. I sat at my desk, watching the clock tick down, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. There was so much at stake, not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been victimized by Karen's schemes. She had controlled so many lives for so long, and now we had the chance to take her down once and for all. The thought of it should have been comforting, but it only heightened the pressure. What if something went wrong? What if she had a backup plan? What if we weren't fast enough? Diana called me again. We've got the accounts. We're set to intercept the transfers, but we need you to be on standby in case we need to move on this quickly. Karen's going to make her move soon, and we need to act fast. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'm ready. Let me know as soon as it's time. We spent the next few hours preparing for the operation. The authorities were in place, ready to move on the accounts as soon as the green light was given. The plan was simple. Freeze the accounts, seize the assets, and use the leverage to force Karen's associates to turn on her. But as I waited, the gnawing feeling in my stomach only grew. There was something in the back of my mind telling me that this wouldn't be as easy as it seemed. Then the call came. We're ready, Diana said, her voice tense. It's happening now. We need you to stay close. We'll need your testimony once this is over. I held my breath as I hung up the phone. This was it, the moment we had been working toward. In that brief second of silence, everything that had happened between Karen and me, everything that had built up to this point, rushed through my mind. I thought back to the moment when she first started targeting me, to the threats, to the gun she'd pulled on me. It felt like a lifetime ago. And now, everything was about to change. Within minutes, the call came through again. We've done it, Diana said. The accounts have been frozen. We've got them. The transfer has been stopped. I exhaled in relief, but I knew that this wasn't the end. Now we had to make sure Karen couldn't escape the consequences. The authorities would take it from here, but I knew Karen wasn't going to accept this defeat quietly. She had too much at stake. She had spent years building her empire, and the idea of losing it all would send her into a frenzy. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The media picked up on the story, and the details of Karen's financial fraud began to spread. People in the community who had once been afraid of her began speaking out, sharing their stories of how Karen had manipulated them. The walls were closing in on her, but Karen was far from done. As we sat in a meeting with the police, they explained what they had uncovered. Karen has been using a network of shell companies to hide her assets, but we've identified most of them now. We're going after her real estate deals next. I nodded, but something felt off. What if she's already trying to cover her tracks again? The officer looked at me seriously. She's trying, but we've got her on the financial side. We'll need your help to testify, to explain how she manipulated the HOA, how she used her power to get people to sign contracts they didn't understand. I could see how important this was. If we could get Karen's story out into the open, expose her methods, we could prevent her from ever hurting anyone again. But there was still so much left to uncover. Karen's entire operation had been built on deception, and she would stop at nothing to keep it intact. Over the next few weeks, Diana and I worked tirelessly, piecing together everything we had learned about Karen's empire. We met with witnesses, interviewed more people who had been hurt by her actions, and worked closely with the police to make sure we had a strong case. But the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Karen's people were still lurking in the background, watching us, trying to figure out a way to stop us from getting any further. One night, after a long day of meetings, I received another message. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The text simply read, "You're out of your depth. Walk away before it's too late." It wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. Karen's associates were desperate, and they were getting more brazen. They knew the walls were closing in, and they were trying to scare me into giving up. But I wasn't going to back down now. I had already come too far. Diana and I stayed on high alert, knowing that the real fight was still ahead of us. Karen wasn't going to let go without a fight. But with each piece of evidence we uncovered, with each ally we brought into the fold, I could feel the grip of her empire loosening. It was only a matter of time before Karen would face the consequences of her actions. The pressure was mounting as we moved forward. Despite Karen's arrest, her influence was still evident in the subtle ways she tried to manipulate people around her. Her network of allies had not yet fallen, and there were still whispers in the community that she might somehow wiggle her way out of the mess she had created. But this time, Karen's tricks weren't enough. The web she had so carefully constructed was unraveling faster than she could stitch it back together. As the investigation progressed, we uncovered more of Karen's connections. It turned out she had been operating a series of side businesses, all tied to the real estate deals she had been orchestrating. She had turned the HOA into a gateway for her own personal financial gain, and the more we uncovered, the deeper her criminal activities seemed to go. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction every time another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But it wasn't enough just to expose Karen. We had to make sure that everyone involved in her network faced justice. The people she had bribed, the contractors she had blackmailed, and the politicians who had allowed her to operate unchecked. Everyone needed to be held accountable. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting with the authorities when we got a call that sent a chill through me. Karen had somehow managed to contact one of her old associates from the local government. She was attempting to leverage her connections, trying to intimidate the investigators into dropping the charges. "We're going to need to step up security," one of the officers said as he put down the phone. "Karen is already making moves to get herself out of this. She's trying to pull strings from behind the scenes." Diana's face tightened as she processed the information. We knew she wouldn't give up easily. It's time to go on the offensive. We can't let her drag this out any longer. We began making plans to safeguard the investigation. The last thing we needed was for Karen's influence to stretch into the police or the courts. We knew that Karen had allies everywhere, and she wasn't going to let herself lose without a fight. The next step was to act fast, seal off any leaks, and make sure she couldn't play any more games. But the deeper we dug, the more unsettling things became. As we examined Karen's financial records more closely, we found that she had been moving large sums of money out of the country. It wasn't just the properties and contracts she had been hiding. Karen had been laundering money through offshore accounts, funneling it into secret bank accounts that only a few people knew about. This was no longer just a case of a corrupt HOA president. This was international money laundering. Diana and I didn't waste any time. We gathered the necessary documents and went straight to the authorities. "We need to freeze these accounts," Diana said, her voice firm. "If Karen has already started to move the money, we can't let her get away with it. This is bigger than just her. It's about stopping this network from growing." I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. We were in deep, and Karen's web was far more complicated than I had initially realized. But I also knew that if we could act quickly, we could stop her from disappearing with all the stolen funds. As the investigation unfolded, Karen's associates were starting to feel the pressure too. One by one, they began to turn on her. The people who had once supported her, the ones who had kept her secrets, were slowly coming forward with information. Some of them were scared of what Karen would do if they spoke out, but others were simply tired of living in fear. They wanted to make things right, and they knew that the truth would come out eventually. Every day, more people came forward to share their stories, and every piece of evidence made Karen's crimes clearer. It was starting to feel like the walls were closing in on her, but there was still a part of me that worried she might find a way to slip out of it all. Karen had always been good at covering her tracks, and I couldn't afford to get complacent now. Then, one evening, Diana and I met with one of Karen's former business partners. This man had been with her from the beginning, working alongside her to orchestrate the real estate scams that had been central to her fraud. He had been one of the first people to see Karen for what she was, and he was ready to testify against her. "They're not just going after her anymore," he said, looking around nervously. "They're going after the whole operation. If you want to make sure she gets what she deserves, you need to make sure the whole system falls apart." His words hit home. The more we learned, the more we realized that Karen had been the mastermind behind an entire network of criminals. The HOA was just the tip of the iceberg. There were other neighborhoods, other deals, and other people who had been manipulated in the same way. But this time, it wasn't just about exposing Karen. It was about dismantling everything she had built. We couldn't allow her to walk away with the stolen money, the properties, or the power she had used to hurt so many people. The battle wasn't just about Karen. It was about everyone she had victimized, everyone whose life she had touched. We had to make sure she never had the chance to do it again. As the investigation progressed, Karen's empire began to collapse piece by piece. The evidence that had once seemed so scattered and disjointed now formed a cohesive narrative, one that revealed the full extent of her manipulation. I watched as the authorities seized more properties linked to her fraudulent transactions, each one a symbol of the control she had once exerted over the community. But even as Karen's operation crumbled, I knew we weren't done yet. She had deep pockets, powerful allies, and a network of people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Every day, I received more threats, anonymous phone calls, cryptic messages left on my doorstep. It was clear that Karen was pulling all the strings she could, trying to silence me before I could expose the full extent of her crimes. But there was something different about her this time. She was growing desperate. The once confident woman who had held so much power now seemed smaller, more vulnerable. As her world fell apart, she became more erratic, more aggressive. She had no one left to hide behind, no one left to cover for her. Diana and I worked tirelessly to piece together the remaining details of the case. Each day brought new revelations about Karen's involvement in money laundering, bribery, and corruption. She had used her position as the HOA president to manipulate property values, inflate repair costs, and pressure homeowners into selling their properties at a loss. We had traced back multiple fraudulent contracts, some of which had been signed by unsuspecting residents who didn't even realize they were being taken advantage of. The more we uncovered, the more my resolve solidified. Karen had used fear to control the community, but now it was her own fear that was starting to show. She had no way out anymore, and as the authorities closed in on her, I knew it was only a matter of time before she was caught. One afternoon, I received an urgent call from Diana. "The final piece is about to fall into place," she said, her voice urgent. "We've just found a direct connection between Karen and the politician who was helping her launder money. This could be the key to ending it once and for all." The news sent a wave of excitement through me. We had known that Karen's influence reached beyond the HOA, but this was the confirmation we needed. The politician had been using his position to shield Karen from legal repercussions and help her cover up her criminal activities. With this evidence, we could take down not only Karen, but the entire network she had built. We immediately set up a meeting with the authorities to discuss our next steps. The stakes had never been higher. If we were going to expose the full extent of Karen's criminal empire, we had to act quickly. The politician was a key player in her operation, and if he was willing to go down with her, the damage could be catastrophic. The next few days were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and more digging into Karen's finances. We worked around the clock, preparing everything we had gathered to ensure that when the time came, Karen would have no way to escape justice. It was a delicate balancing act. If we tipped our hand too early, Karen might have time to flee or destroy the evidence. But if we waited too long, she could slip through the cracks again. Finally, the moment arrived. The police executed a coordinated raid on Karen's property and the politician's office. They arrested several of her associates, and we were able to seize more of her assets, including the bank accounts that had been used to funnel money overseas. It was the culmination of everything we had worked for, the moment when Karen's empire finally began to crumble. As I watched the authorities take Karen into custody, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. But it wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about the people who had been affected by our lies and manipulation, the neighbors who had been forced to pay unjust fines, the homeowners who had lost their savings. This was for them. It wasn't just about me taking down a corrupt HOA president. It was about making sure she could never hurt anyone again. But even as the police took Karen away, I knew the fight wasn't over. The community was still reeling from everything Karen had done. There were still people who hadn't spoken out, still stories that needed to be told. The road to healing would be long, and it would require more than just the end of Karen's reign. As I sat down to reflect on everything that had happened, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woman who had tried to control everything, who had once held the entire neighborhood in the palm of her hand, was now powerless. And while the battle had been long and hard, it was worth it. The community was beginning to rebuild, and although there was still much work to be done, I knew that the first step had been taken. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and the truth had triumphed. It wasn't just about the victory in court. It was about reclaiming control of our lives and our neighborhood. We had fought back, and we had won. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more updates on how we continue to expose corruption and bring justice where it's needed.